Hey, friends. I'm glad you're watching this segment. I'm Jeffrey Rickman. I'm a Global Methodist elder, and this is my podcast, Plain Spoken. I talk to lots of different kinds of people on here because knowledge is a big topic, and I need lots of knowledge from different people from different places. And the reason that you're subscribed, and if you're not subscribed, you should be subscribed, is because you agree that it's good to learn from different people, hear different stories, consider different perspectives. Today, I'm interviewing a gentleman named Robert Sparkman. He's senior status Global Methodist clergy in North Alabama Conference, and he was active in the United Methodist Church for a long time on the general conference level, advocating for fair representation. He's watched some of my stuff. He got in contact with me because he saw that I was concerned about how it is that the Global Methodist Church lays itself out to have fair representation from people groups all around the world. It's one thing to choose the name Global Methodist and choose your first meeting to be in San Jose. It's another thing to actually create a body that fairly represents all the people groups that are tied to this new body. And so I wanted to learn from Robert and his history. I wanted to hear his thoughts on wise decisions that the Global Methodist Church can make at next month's convening conference. And so he agreed to come on camera with me. And this is very loosely structured. I just said, I want to hear your story. I want to hear how things add up to you. And then we're going to aim to spend the last 5 to 10 minutes in what we're hoping for the Global Methodist Church. I can't say that he and I are going to be on the same page, although I expect we probably will be. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have written me. Although, if this is a very different viewpoint from mine, I think that's nothing but helpful. So I'm not going to pretend to know what's coming. I just know it's going to be a worthy conversation where we get some much needed history. I still need to figure out. And here's how it interacts with us. We've got a lot of voices in the Global Methodist Church saying, don't look behind. Don't worry about what happened. Don't worry about what the United Methodist Church had. Let's just focus on going ahead. Let's go be positive. And I've been one of the voices saying that's wrong. We need to learn the lessons from where we came. We cannot reproduce the history that led us to that awful point of needing to disaffiliate. I do not want to see the division and destruction in the GMC that we have just seen and are continuing to see in the United Methodist Church. So to that end, I want to turn to an elder that has things to teach me and you in this time. Friends, this is Reverend Robert Sparkman, and he's going to be representing his history, especially on the fair representation group, which I know nothing about. So at this point, I'm hopefully going to talk less. My intention is only to bring about the good stuff that Robert has to offer. And so, Robert, I want to start by just thanking you for making the time to visit with me and my audience.
I'm glad to be here. The way you frame that's very interesting, because I think what I want to end up saying is if we devolve into just naked politics, power politics, we're lost. And I think that's the main thing I'd like to say about this whole presentation.
Yeah, there has been a larger conversation about, well, in the context of the Episcopal candidates, they initially refused interviews with me because they didn't want to do politicking. They didn't want to have the feeling of politicking from the United Methodist Church. They didn't want to participate in this feeling like, well, everybody hated the politics of the UMC. And so maybe one of the things that this conversation can cover is the defining characteristics of dysfunctional politics in the UMC, and maybe a vision for how the Global Methodist Church could be different. So I don't want to hamstring you too much, but I do want you to feel free to speak to that topic if you want to. So why don't, before we get into you telling the story of what happened in the UMC, could you tell the audience just a little bit, a broad view sketch of who you are, what your service record has been?
Sure. When I got to seminary, I made sense of some things that happened to me in my childhood. When I was about 10 years old, the church started singing nothing but Methodist hymns and singing Amen at the end of the hymn. And we were told we couldn't sing any other hymns, but we're in the Methodist Church, and I thought that was odd. Found out that the General Conference of 1960 had tried to standardize United Methodist worship, and it didn't work out for small town churches, which is where I was in Aliceville, Alabama, in the Black Belt. Then a few years later, I was a high school representative on the board of the church, and they told us we had to have a council on ministries, and we discussed that the whole time I was on there. What went here, what went there. And later, I just thought it never worked. And so that came down from a general conference decision. But when I began to serve, I was very interested and served for 45 years in North Alabama, 44 years in the United Methodist Church, and then I did a year of interim after I retired. And I started talking to a district superintendent about the general conference, and I did not like our stance on abortion. I didn't like our stance on, liberation theology in the Board of Global Ministries. And he said, well, Robert, the general conference. And so I started trying to be active and get elected to that because I had some things that I thought needed to be done. I didn't think our representation from North Alabama was representative of the conference. As a matter of fact, one of the people I talked to in another conference says, why do you always send such a liberal delegation to general conference? And we just elected very large church pastors and DSs and institutional people. And it turns out they were voting not as we thought they were. So that was the start of all that.
About when was that? What years was that when you started entering into general conference?
1980s is when I had that discussion with the DS, and then I was elected as a reserve delegate in 1996 as a 42-year-old, and went to Denver, and it was a huge deal. One of the things I learned there, I wanted to get into every one of the little subcommittees and things. I was fascinated by all of it. And I picked out a subcommittee of the Board of Global Ministries that I thought was going to be important. And they were going to meet 9 o'clock at night in this particular room, which I couldn't find. And I wandered around, finally got there a little bit late. And every one of the members of that subcommittee were members of the women's division of the Board of Global Ministries. And they were going to make broad policies that were going to be passed the next day and or the next day after that. And that taught me something, that they had organized. They knew the levers of power. They knew what was going to happen. They got the leadership of the subcommittee on missions that was meeting and the legislative committee on missions, and they knew how to do it. And I thought, well, somebody's got to get this organized for people that are not liberationists and others. Just a sub note on liberation theology, if your audience doesn't know, which I think they will. But when I was in seminary, I had a friend who was a professor and had supervised ministry with him. And in his classes on mission, he was just a straight Marxist. I mean, it was just like he taught Marxism and put a little bit of Bible with it, is what he did. And so when I was there, I realized that was Marxism. I just graduated in political science from Auburn, and saw that whole structure in that. So when I was there in that subcommittee, that's what was represented. That's what was lifted up. Mission people that wanted to go into mission from North Alabama that were my friends got either waylaid or delayed or whatever, unless they made the same right choices. So I wanted to be active in general conference. In 1996, then, that was a very interesting whole process there in Denver. But the main thing I got out of that was we weren't organized. We actually, I thought, had numbers, from the people I was talking to, but it was hard to get the wrench on the system. So we went to jurisdictional conference in 1996 at Lake Junaluska. And the lay leader of North Georgia got up and said, we need to get organized for better representation because it seems that we're not represented well. So they didn't have any numbers on that. You couldn't ask anybody and say, how many people from North Georgia relative to how many people from CalPAC or something like that. And they didn't have those numbers that they could just hand you. So one of the members of my delegation joined with him and others from the Southeast, because we knew that the Southeast wasn't fairly represented. We had those numbers. So they began to meet, and about a year later, they invited me to join that. So I joined that group in 1997. And we found that the Southeastern jurisdiction was underrepresented tremendously.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we got one delegate for every 13,000 church members in the Southeastern jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
And the Western jurisdiction got a delegate for every 5,000 church members.
Mm-hmm.
And Africa was tremendously more underrepresented than that. And so the reason for that was the formula that was there had to take two different aspects: the number of church members and the number of ministers, ordained ministers.
Full-time?
It didn't have to be full-time. It could be
Okay.
retired, part-time, whatever, but they had to be ordained. They could be teaching. They could be a chaplain serving in Hawaii or wherever from North Georgia, and they were counted in that number.
Okay.
So they overrepresented the number of members on that formula. Somewhere down the line, when that happened, they emphasized the number of ministers, which gave the California Pacific conferences that had very, very small membership, but they had a lot of chaplains, they had a lot of professors and other things like that, that overrepresented them. Underrepresented the growing conferences that had larger churches. You might have 3,000 members, 4 ministers, and those kind of things, and tremendously underrepresented Africa because they were just growing. They only had a few ordained ministers and a huge number of members. In large churches, maybe a whole village would convert to Methodism in the Benue River Valley, where I've been active in Nigeria, by the way. I know you've had several. Yes, I've been over there 5 times. We built a school there.
Oh, wow.
Things like that. So
Nigeria is so interesting. I'm feeling the need to kind of, for my audience, try and track out the ground we've already covered, because you've already shared so much good stuff. Within the United Methodist Church, one of the things that was noticed throughout, especially by the confessing movement, was that people on the political left, theological left, largely overlapped, and they generally organized better than people on the right. They were able to claim the high ground in the denomination very early on in the academy, in the general boards and agencies, and they organized better on the legislative level, and that's where the confessing movement largely came from. Good News and a lot of groups like that came out of kind of a reactive response to institutional takeover from leftist ideology, part of which being, liberation theology, which you've talked about, and theologized Marxism. These things were real. These things were observable, and you saw it firsthand in your own delegation, and then you started participating in jurisdictional and general conference stuff where you got to see how it was that the deck was stacked in favor of the left. The Western jurisdiction and its composite conferences lean far left, and then the Southeastern jurisdiction is pretty old school, biblical, right-leaning, conservative, orthodox. You could use a lot of different terms, but the densest, most vibrant area of the United Methodist Church, the Southeast jurisdiction, was underrepresented, and then the dying liberal progressive area of the West was overrepresented, and then areas abroad, overseas, like Nigeria, different African nations, Asian areas, were also underrepresented because of this formula that was drafted before you came in to look at it. So one of the things I've wondered about is who drafted the formula, and why was it never revised to a simple, I don't even like the membership thing, because membership can be bloated and over-reported. Why not just in-person attendance, average in-person attendance? It seems to me that that's how any equitable system would be assigned. Was there ever any serious talk about redoing that formula, or was it something that was just set in stone and nobody could do anything about it?
Well, we tried in 2000, so that started in 1996 and started meeting, and we tried in 2000, were not successful, but we had a formula that would improve the situation, but you never get perfect representation, proportionate representation, because the small conferences are so small and they still get 2 delegates.
Oh, so it's like the U.S. Senate where you have a mandatory minimum that doesn't correspond with the population. Okay, I understand.
Right. And it's built into the number that come to general conference.
So there's always
This
going to
gets
be
a little
that inequity.
complicated, and it took us years to unpack all this stuff. But
Okay.
the answer to your question, I think, about why two different things is that at one time only ministers went to annual conference and
Oh,
general
sure.
conference, and so that was a reform to say, well, we're going to do church members and ministers. That was like a laity thing. And that's my understanding. I didn't read that in a book. Somebody told me that. So you'll have to look that up. Somebody like Lonnie Brooks that knows everything in the
Right.
history of the Methodist Church will have to tell
Interesting.
you.
Yeah.
Um, so, um, but you can't get perfect representation. That's why I keep going back to when a church, like a local church, if it starts just being a political thing and my friends have the votes here and we're going to do what we want to do, you've already lost the deal. It doesn't matter who wins. Are you
Yeah.
understand what I'm saying? And
I think
so
so. Yeah,
I'm
whenever
not
there's
recommending
personal
to the
egos
general
get
to the
involved in territory and it's not about the integrity of the theology behind a thing or the equity, but it's really just this is so and so's initiative and he has this rank in the denomination. And so, or in your case, you were talking about going to this meeting that was dominated by women. Was it UMW? I don't know. There was some
yes.
group, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they already have their agenda and they've decided they're going to get their way and they're going to set meetings in places where the other members don't even know how to get there, that's just one sign of really crooked politicking where you're not really seeking the will of the body, you're seeking the success of an agenda. And there did has always seemed, I mean, even before the formation of the United Methodist Church, it seems to me that there was a leftist agenda that it was just understood by those in authority that ultimately mainline Methodism would fall in line with, and folks like you just didn't understand the script that had already been written, and you were kicking against the goads. How much do you think that?
Well,
Go ahead.
let me say this about your comment there.
Yeah.
That's fair. If
Okay.
if you get warring parties and one of them says, okay, I can get this person elected and we're going to have the meeting there, that's perfectly fair. I've got something that wasn't fair that happened in 2012, as bad as not inviting the Africans to General Conference last May, and as bad as ignoring the discipline. But those kind of things are fair, but you just don't want to go there. You just don't want to have a church that is a political power struggle. And once you get there, you've lost.
So
And
how
a,
would
a
you
movement,
how
a
would you help
movement.
people like think
I've
through
also been
that?
in churches.
Because we all agree we don't like politics. But I mean, anytime you get groups of people together, there's going to be some form of politics. So what are the markers of a dysfunctional politics that we do not want in the GMC? And then what healthy political exercises do you think we could have and should welcome in the GMC? Do you have many thoughts on that?
Well, in a local church, it can be a movement and it starts growing and people are happy and they may disagree with a policy that is made, but they go along with it.
Hmm.
We made once a very difficult decision in a church to relocate. We'd increased attendance by double, and we wanted to relocate to a better area, better location, and continue to grow.
Hmm.
And it was divisive, but this one guy got up, and he was one of the respected members of the church. He said, now, we've always had disagreements, and then we go along with what the vote is,
Hmm.
and we make it work. And so that's the spirit that has to be there. And I also think that if you have permanent division, permanent groups that go against each other in a local church or in any organization, I think that's dysfunctional for the functioning and well working of the organization. And I think that's one reason that we got down to 15%. I think they said vital churches in the United Methodist Church at one time in the U.S. By certain categories was because of that fight that has been going on since the 1960s, at least, probably back into the 1930s.
And we're
So
talking about
I
the
think that
homosexuality fight.
no, I'm talking about evangelism. You couldn't say some things in some churches about evangelism without people saying, well, now let's define evangelism. We don't want to be, we don't want to be one of those churches. Evangelism, the divinity of Christ, theological things that you could get a lot of conversation about in certain places. And those things defined before homosexuality, the two groups that were fighting.
So a lot of people don't know this
race did at
history.
one time. Race did define in the South. You have to admit that. And two groups of people, and then at some point it became an accepted norm, and everybody went along with it. And then we could have become healthier at that point. But the left kept going. I mean, the more liberal people just kept going further out, away from the doctrines and things. And then homosexuality was just a touch point there, I think. But
Yep.
a healthy politics in a church is where you go along with the majority, you make it work, and you don't try to divisively organize and throw shade at each other, or, what's the new word? Smoke screen, or whatever that is.
Gaslight.
Gaslighting.
Yeah.
So you know it when you see it, right, Jeffrey? You know a healthy church when you see it. You know a healthy organization when you see it, and you know an unhealthy one. And I think the two permanent warring parties within an organization is always unhealthy. And I think that would be a good way to end that conversation.
Well, it's of interest to me because I'm trying to figure out what posture I want to hold as the GMC continues to develop. And I'm always wary of an institutional power demanding everybody fall in line or get out. And so I do think that there's a role for raising questions, sharing concerns, and that's largely what I understood Good News to be doing in the confessing movement within the United Methodist Church. But they definitely also represented if you look at the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, the two-party system where one is always left, one is always right, and they're always fighting and duking it out and using what means they can to win, you definitely saw a similar structure develop in the United Methodist Church. And whereas I was very clear that Reconciling Ministries Network and Love Prevails and these other special interest groups really were not helpful for the discourse, I very much appreciated Good News and Life Watch and other right-leaning advocacy groups because I saw them as reacting to a very unhelpful, degrading influence in the church. To listen to you now...
Well, once you get to that point where there's that big division, then you have to organize, as you said. So that we're getting back to that organization. We had this organization and we got the formula, couldn't get it passed in 2000. 2004, it got passed. And so it wasn't perfect representation, and you'll never get to perfect representation because you have two minimum on the smallest conferences. You had conferences in different places, had 350 members and had two representatives to general conference. And so, and then you had huge ones that couldn't be represented. So I think and so we did get it passed, and that's when, and also Africa began to tremendously grow in the 2000s, right around 2000, Africa. And we didn't foresee this. The Fair Representation Group was focusing on the Southeastern jurisdiction, the South Central jurisdiction, getting them more delegates so we could reemphasize evangelism, reemphasize traditional theology. And there were actually moderates and progressives from Virginia and other places that worked with the Fair Representation Committee in Florida and others because they wanted their conference to be fairly represented. They were not necessarily in it to get more evangelism or to make everything more conservative. So I think that's the reason that we prevailed at that point, because we had moderate people that said, just fairly, I've got to look at this and say, we can't continue to underrepresent the growing conferences. If we do, we'll never turn it around. And that's what we said. If we fairly represent the growing conferences like North Georgia, South Alabama, Africa and other places, then we'll gradually turn the church around over generations. So we got it passed in 2004. In 2008, we had a very conservative conference in 2008. And I thought began to turn things around. I thought it was very good. Mm-hmm. The only thing that happened there is they passed a regionalization thing that had been, using the word gaslighting again, we ought to retire that word, but they had told the Africans it wouldn't affect them, but it would affect them because it would affect everything at General Conference, which would affect them. And it was passed. And then the annual conferences voted it down tremendously. Mm. And, by a large margin, they voted the regionalization plan down. And so I can go on now with the story if you want to, or did I interrupt you?
I want to retread some steps because one of the things that hasn't been said for some of our viewers is these years that he's highlighting are years that the General Conference met, which is the conciliar body that speaks for the whole denomination. So as Robert got involved with this, it's probably not properly understood as a caucus group, but a group of people that are trying to get fair representation going on. He's plugging into these larger events where real shift is happening. And in I think you said 1992. Well, the first thing I wanted to paint a picture of a little bit more, and you said all this, but I just want to make sure people hear it. The division in the UMC was always bigger than homosexuality. Yes, homosexuality was pushed on the left from the very beginning, but there were more fundamental theological issues that never got resolved and are embarrassingly simple. So when he's talking about evangelism, there was a big fight in the General Board of Global Missions or Ministry. I always forget what it's called. But there was a distaste on the left for making the name of Christ Jesus explicit or in any way requisite for people to engage with the United Methodist Church, to do anything beyond material help and compensation. Entering into the realm of the spiritual was seen as just uncouth and inappropriate for United Methodist missionaries. And for that reason, modern day TMS Global, the Mission Society, was formed for evangelicals to funnel their money to, so that Jesus could still be proclaimed with their dollars. But you saw this mirrored in almost every general agency. The left took the high ground and made tradition.
I would agree with that about the Board of Global Ministries on the national level and on the structural level, but individual missionaries were tremendous all through that time. It was the structure I blame for liberation theology and the hiring of missionaries that did what you were talking about doing. But there were a lot of great people out there, and influenced the Nigerian church to grow during that time. Ethel Johnson and others that were tremendous evangelists and lifted up the name of Christ. So just want to say that was a little bit too broad of a statement there, and just wanted to say that.
No, I'm glad you did. And so evangelism was not the only theological area you hit on. Christology, how serious we should be about Christ being God in the flesh, or the virgin birth. These things are all places where there was perpetual fighting for years and no resolution. And so leading up to 1992, I did want to come back. You said 1992 was a pivotal General Conference year that laid the ground for what came next. And I think you said that
1996 was the first one that I went to. Okay. They woke up to the discrepancies and the unfairness. Okay. We tried to get it passed in 2000, didn't do it. It got passed in 2004. Mm-hmm. And before we really thought it would happen, we thought it would be a generational thing, but it happened just in 8 years. And then in 2008, we went and got the boards and agencies more fairly represented, Jeffrey. Mm. This was one of the biggest things that happened. And we went out west to Texas and talked to some people, and had Bishop Jones was in the group. He was a professor there, and we had some leaders of the South Central jurisdiction. And I did one of the presentations about how each board was elected. Everyone was elected differently, but almost everyone had about 10 delegates that were selected by the board itself, which meant that the staff were really selecting them and they were passing these out. And the conclusion that I told them I made on this is that these boards were more self-selected than they were fairly selected by the jurisdictional conferences. Mm. And then I saw that again when I was on a jurisdictional nominating committee that that nominated people for the different things. I nominated someone for the publishing house one time, and they actually recessed to go and talk to the head of the publishing house to see if that was acceptable to him. I'm serious to you, Jeffrey. I'm telling you that that is the kind of thing that was happening. So, so we got it where the boards and agencies were more fairly represented. And even though, and what would happen though, is the South Central and Southeastern jurisdiction nominating committees would send a balanced representation of evangelicals and progressives, and the Northeast and North Central and West would send liberal representation, of course, and so they always dominated. And that goes again, you will never find a way that that doesn't happen if you have a big division and everybody is just politically going for their domination and their way. It's just hard to do that. So in those 4 years, we had substantial minorities on all the boards that were representing evangelical concerns and others. And you want to stop there because 2012 is where something happened that I thought was extremely.
Well, I do want to explain general boards and agencies a little bit more for our audience. A lot will know this, but between sessions of General Conference, there are different boards and agencies that are established to carry forward the work of the General Conference. So the way it was supposed to work was every 4 years they gather and they say what they stand for, what direction they want to go, and they task the boards and agencies with how to carry out their mission. And so the way it's supposed to work is that the boards and agencies then organize themselves fairly to represent the people that have commissioned them with these duties, and that has to do some with the composition of the body that leads them, but it also has a theological thing. And what we found out over time was that general boards and agencies started seeing the local church as obligated to support them rather than themselves obligated to support the local church. There was a directionality crisis that happened such that they would be given explicit tasks or mandates by the General Conference that they flatly refused to do, or they would sometimes advocate for things that the General Conference had spoken against. And in particular, the General Board of Church and Society was, I'm going to paint with a broad brush again, virtually a wing of the Democrat Party, especially with respect to the topic of abortion, and the General Conference had to act very flatly to tell them to take a certain stance on abortion and take a certain stance on international persecution of the church, and they flatly refused to do what they were told, or begrudgingly ended some relationships they were told to. So in the composition of the leadership of these groups, one of the things that was noticed and continues to be true today is the leadership boards of the different boards and commissions are overwhelmingly Western, white, and liberal, such that there are hardly any Africans or Filipinos on any of these boards or agencies, even though they did compose at least a quarter of the church, if probably more than half. So there was already huge representation issues on all the boards and agencies. And then you got involved to ameliorate that problem such that there would be more equitable representation theologically and also regionally in the general boards and agencies. You did that legwork, and how did it go?
Well, I thought we were making progress, especially with the Board of Global Ministries, and we would get together, and other leaders in the fair representation thing said, Board of Global Ministries has really responded to the new representatives, and they want to represent Africa. In that restructuring of boards and agencies boards, we only put 10% from the central conferences, from the former central conferences, from Africa and Philippines and Europe, because the boards and agencies were saying that it would be impossible to make that big of a change and bring a third of their board from Africa and Asia and other places like that. So we compromised, had 10% on there. And then anytime you gave one representative to Europe, they were overrepresented. If one person came to a board from Europe, they were tremendously overrepresented because they were so small. And it would be difficult to get the number of people from the 600,000 members in Nigeria, the 1 million people in Cote d'Ivoire, which came in about that time. So the picture was we were making progress. The boards and agencies staff did not like it. And they were in many of the boards making plans to make their own legislation to go back the way it was before. And Africa was growing by leaps and bounds. We were going to have to give the central conferences more delegates and more to Africa in the coming days. So they had representatives that came to Tampa in 2012 that put the representation back on North Central, Northeast, and West, and cut representation to central conferences and reduce representation other places.
How'd they do that?
So that they would get what's that?
How did they do that?
Well, they just put different numbers in a resolution to revise that part of the discipline that defined the representation of the boards and agencies.
Was that something that right-leaning caucus groups saw and tried to mobilize against, or was it something that was just kind of voted on without anybody seeing?
We tried to do that because it was our proposals, and we were going to try to defeat that in the legislative committees in Tampa. So that's the kind of politics that we're talking about, and we would say, okay, you go to this place, you go to this place, and you try to get this resolution defeated. And but the main thing that happened at that point is that the regionalization plan had been defeated in annual conference votes. So that wasn't but they came with a thing called the Plan UMC. Do you remember that, Jeffrey?
Yeah.
And we were going to restructure the boards and agencies, put a connectional table that would ensure that the boards and agencies came into compliance with the Book of Discipline. You mentioned the Board of Global Board of Church and Society there. And we were going to bring them all into the same direction, going in the same direction, rather than everyone,
and as I recall,
different ones going into.
It was going to be a smaller budget. It was going to be more streamlined. It was based on this Towers-Watson report on good functioning organizations. It was kind of a slam dunk where obviously things were too spread out. I mean, there was a different communications department for each of the general boards and agencies. Totally unnecessary. Way too many employees, way too bloated. Should have been an easy thing, and yet it was shut down. Yeah. So
in Plan UMC, we had fair representation on all the boards and agencies, and even went further and gave Africa more representation. So it was UMC, and we knew that we weren't too concerned when some of these resolutions passed in other legislative committees. There were other legislative committees that passed a new legislation that went back to the old way of representing the boards and agencies. But we weren't too concerned because we really felt like we had the votes. And so Plan UMC passed. Fair representation was redone, and it was endorsed again by the 2012 General Conference. And then about an hour before the end of General Conference, the Judicial Council made a ruling that struck down the legality of Plan UMC.
Oh, I didn't remember. It was the Judicial Council.
It was the Judicial Council that struck it down. It passed by the General Conference. The Judicial Council struck it down. So, and their reasoning was that we had given authority to the boards and agencies, or the connectional table, that was reserved for General Conference. During the General Conference, however, we had made revisions, and those revisions, we felt, did away with that problem of giving too much authority to the connectional table. And the people that were really working on Plan UMC, the only thing I did was to make sure fair representation got in Plan UMC, but some of our leadership was working with Plan UMC, and I was kind of there trying to keep the fair representation issue on the front burner. And they said and made an article after General Conference that the ruling was evidently made before we got to General Conference because it did not respond to the revisions that had been made in Legislative Committee and passed on the floor.
Interesting. So the notion was that so here's the concern that a lot of people have had is that even though the buck stops at the General Conference, that is the will of the body, that there have been institutional forces that have finessed or limited or conditioned they have limited the options of what the council can actually conclude. So they saw the writing on the wall that there was public support for Plan UMC, but it threatened them. So they had probably Plan B, Plan C, Plan D. If this, then we do that. If this, then we do that. And they already had this ruling from the Judicial Council in the pocket in the event that it passed the vote, where they could just say, well, it doesn't pass constitutional muster, it's not going to work, and that's the end of it, and there's no appeal available. So it kind of reveals that they really had no interest of letting the General Conference body actually speak for itself. Even they gave the illusion of choice, but when they made the wrong choice, they just outlawed it with a decision that was already predetermined before the conference even got together.
That is what some of the leaders of the Plan UMC movement felt like, and they passed. I wrote an article for the United Methodist Reporter, and it was published, and that's what they said that they believed. So the last part of this story is that so some of the boards and agencies went back to the way they had been represented before, and except for Board of Discipleship and Board of Higher Education and Ministry, had been in the General Administration Legislative Committee where Plan UMC was. And we had the votes in that committee. So they did not bring up those two proposals, those two resolutions, legislative acts for voting. And because they did not bring those up for vote, they could be brought up on the floor of the General Conference. If they had been voted down, they would not have been able to be brought up on the floor of the General Conference. Now, this was unusual, Jeffrey, because they made a big push to get every legislative piece voted on in prior General Conferences. Everyone was going to be voted on before we got through with the General Conference, but they left several of them out. So about 30 minutes before the end of General Conference, the bishop got up and said, we have some housekeeping to do. There are some routine legislative pieces that we need to pass just to keep the wheels turning and to go forward. And those two pieces of legislation were in a list of those resolutions that he flashed on the screen. And I looked up and saw the restructuring of the Board of Discipleship and Board of Higher Education and Ministry up there on that screen. Now, remember, we were just reeling from the Judicial Council having struck down Plan UMC, and everybody was just devastated, or they were celebrating or whatever, but they couldn't believe it happened. Right. And so then they said, here are just some routine things. And it was two of them in there that had not been debated and were not routine. And so I tried to get the attention of the chair. He would not call on me. I actually believe the bishop was sincere. He thought these were just, housekeeping issues, legal things that had to be done. But I think the secretary of the General Conference kind of gave him a nudge. This guy's, talked too much or whatever. And so I didn't get the floor, and all of them passed. And in those two resolutions,
filing a point of order?
You couldn't get the floor to file a point of order. You could yell point of order, and it was just 30 minutes before the end of General Conference. Nobody really wanted to hear what I had to say. So, it was just one of those things. And so the board of discipleship was restructured so that there were an equal number of people on the board from the Southeast, South Central, West, North Central, and Northeast, even though the West was down under 300,000 members, and there were 3 conferences in the Southeast that were almost 300,000 members. Mm-hmm. But they had an equal representation. And then one of those 5 of those people from each jurisdiction would be a nominating committee and bring on the rest of the board. So it was completely self-selected, balanced by jurisdiction, 1-1-1-1-1, and those 5 nominated the rest of the board, except for a couple of things. And the Board of Higher Education Ministry had 2 from Southeast, 2 from South Central, 2 from West, 2 from Central, North Central, and 2 from the Northeast, and they nominated the rest of the board. Completely self-selected. I thought it was the worst thing. So we got to jurisdictional conference, and I was the jurisdictional nominating person in 2016, not 2012. And I only had 2 people that I could get nominated from my delegation, which we used to have like a dozen. But the way they restructured everything, you had very, very few people to be nominated at jurisdictional nominating committee. And I made a speech and I said, this is the worst way to, make up our boards and agencies, which at one time had $650 million of undesignated and temporarily designated funds that they reported. And this is why they have so much influence on the African bishops and others, is because of all this, money that is there. It's down to, I understand, $150 million, but I don't know where it went. So it was probably permanently designated or something like that. Anyway, I'm going on to 2016 to illustrate how bad that was, the representation of the boards and agencies. So 2016, we went to Portland, and the water had been poisoned, and nobody wanted to hear about Plan UMC, and some South Central people wanted to be the ones that pushed it, and we never got anywhere with it. And so the boards and agencies stayed represented like that. And I haven't paid any attention about this past general conference where they did that differently, but you can go to the 2012 discipline and see how those boards and agencies are selected to spend all this money that goes for apportionments. And they're very self-selected, controlled by the staff a lot of times, because they bring people, say this would be a good person. The time that I only had 2 slots to put people in 2016, when I was the North Alabama Conference representative on the jurisdictional nominating committee, there were 2 people that were elected at the same vote. One had a few more votes than the other, and one had a few less. And I got those 2 on boards and agencies. That's all I had. And then the other people were upset with me because they said, well, we used to have 10 or 12, and you didn't put any women on there, and you didn't put a black person on there, and you didn't put this. And I said, I'm so sorry. I did the top 2 people on our delegation, and one layperson that had been on a jurisdictional finance committee that was sitting there with me, wanted to get back on that jurisdictional finance committee. That's all we could nominate from the jurisdictional nominating committee, which most people think that's where it comes from. So the point I want to make here is there is a lot of stuff that was, fair politicking, like the subcommittee that I went to in Denver. There was a lot of things that were fair. And that thing in 2012, where they camouflaged the restructuring of the Board of Discipleship and the Board of Higher Education and Ministry, and I think influenced the Judicial Council before they got to 2012 to Tampa. I think that was a step beyond fair politicking. So I didn't think that I could have gotten past all this, and I really am 99% past the split. I'm happy in a Global Methodist Church. I'm preaching in different places. I'm enjoying that, but I felt like this needed to be on the record. And I actually wrote an article at the time, sent it to the United Methodist Reporter, and it was published. Nobody did saying it wasn't true. Nobody sent in and said it wasn't true. I knew it would be easy to go back and find that last journal that was published. They look like this: Daily Christian Advocate, on the last day of the 2012 General Conference, and read all that happened, and then look and see how those two numbered petitions and pieces of legislation affected the representation.
Yeah, for those who have been with me for a while, you know that I covered the last general conference that the United Methodist Church did, and I did my best to keep track of what was happening. And even though I had a decent setup here and I could use the website and the Daily Christian Advocate and try and track down legislation, those of you who tried to do that with me saw how complicated it gets because things move very fast. A lot of things happen between sessions. A lot of things happen during the session that almost seem to intentionally create confusion. They had what were called consent calendars, which were omnibus packages. That's pretty much what you were just describing, where they put a whole list of petitions forward, and they can present them however they want to, as innocuous or common sense of no circumstance. And there is nothing to come back around after the vote and go, oh, actually, this was super circumstantial. Once you have the vote, it counts. And so it takes caucus groups with very intelligent, quick thinking people to alert delegates to, okay, here's what's behind this vote. Here's one of the things that people see at general and annual conferences, and they go, oh, this is unhealthy politics, is there will be like a group of people on a text list where someone will send out text messages saying, okay, if this is what you want with fair representation, then vote this down. A lot of people say, hey, that's controlling the votes. But the thing is, to understand all the implications, not just of the original petitions, but amendments to the petition and how it's in dialogue with other decisions made that day, things move so fast. The picture is so big. It really is helpful to have caucus groups and leaders like you who are getting up and trying to make sure that delegates understand everything. And then whenever power does what it does and institutions do what they do, they have a way of slowing things down when they want to waste time. They have a way of speeding things up when they want to push things through. And they have a way of just putting a stink on things that really would be good, like Plan UMC, but so that delegates just feel like things that should be an option really aren't an option. So these are all the things that I've watched from the outside. I was a local licensed pastor in Idaho, I remember, when Tampa in 2012, and I was just watching from afar going, I can't believe this. And it's been that way at every general conference, just like, these are professionals that get paid six-figure salaries, and this feels so slapped together and unprofessional, and it's just so clear that the floor is being managed. And so as we look at the Global Methodist Church now, I wonder what wisdom you have for any delegates that have spent time with us just to kind of rehearse this history and the dysfunction of the UMC. What prayers are you saying for this convening conference for the GMC? And then what would you encourage the delegates to be mindful of, prayerful about, cognizant of as they approach this task next month?
I will repeat what I said at the beginning, and that is, just caucuses, other things like that. Don't get your little group together and decide the whole church is going to be this way. Allow unless it steps over a line, and I do think, and I really do think, that both groups had issues they felt like were just too much to tolerate within the United Methodist Church. And I felt like we had to divide. And another reason we had to divide was we could not regionalize. We were voting that down in annual conferences. We couldn't restructure the boards and agencies. We couldn't reemphasize evangelism because that had to come from boards and agencies to do it. And so we were, and the decline was continuing and steepening. So it was in a death spiral, and division was necessary. And so it was necessary because people didn't allow this group of the church to be who they had been since camp meeting days. Mm-hmm. And, the Cokesbury singing evangelistic revivalists in the United Methodist Church that were always there, got left out, and that's part of what happened. And then the politics. Once you get into the division of politics and trying to count delegates too much and other things like that, I think you're already heading down a road that is not healthy. If everybody sees themselves as a whole and me a part of that, and I may not worship just like that other guy over there, but I respect that. And as long as we stay within the doctrines of the church and keep the main thing, which is helping people find a relationship with God through Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, through Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit, find that relationship with God and find that commonality there. Rather than our opinion about biblical interpretation or any kind of politics or any kind of structure or any of those other things. See ourselves as a whole and a movement, and let's go.
So I'm still feeling like there are ways in which I'm not fully hearing you, but I do feel like I heard you better the second time through than the first time through. And there's a sermon kind of percolating under the surface here that I wonder if you'd be in favor of. But King David at one point is condemned by God because he insists on doing this census. And, people can argue about the theological significance of this census. But as you're talking, I'm connecting it to these voices that wanted to figure out how the lines were going to fall before the vote. And here's how many are going to come down on this side, and here's how many are going to come down on this side. And here's the ones that we can move, and kind of the chips that we can lay down to, have this give and take in this pork barrel dealing. And you're saying that is not in the nature of God's covenant people. The only thing that we need to keep in mind is we're together in this covenant community. We're not going to draw lines and have factions. We're just all earnestly going to do our prayer and reflection and vote our consciences. And if we devolve back into trusting these different groups that are aligned against each other, then we will pretty easily recreate the sin of the United Methodist Church. Did I hear you correctly?
That's right. That's that. After 3 years of retirement and not having anything to do with the last general conference, that's where I came down.
Okay. Well, I think that gives a lot of good food for thought, and I very much appreciate you recapitulating your history as you saw it. And let me just say, I wish that they had listened to you. I saw John Lomperis wrote an article, I want to say in 2022. I remember it had a picture of an elephant balancing on it, and he went down the line of the general boards and agencies and was able to show just how woefully underrepresented the most productive parts of the UMC were on the boards and agencies. And I wish they'd had the wisdom to listen to you. I wish they'd had the maturity to accept the byproduct of going that direction. But you've described here an institutionally defensive reaction that calcified the institution and all, but I mean, pretty much accelerated the split that we saw. So it is what it is. But thank you so much for your service and your best efforts and attempts to do that.
Let me also say there were probably 40 or 50 or more people that came to these meetings at some time during that 25 years, and lots of great leaders from all over. We tried to get somebody from everybody in the South Central and Southeast, and got some people from the Northeast, and it was a large group of people that wanted that to happen. And I think if we had been able to prevail over generations without these other things kind of turning everything back around, I think the church could have revitalized itself, or God could have revitalized us.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to come right back to Robert. But before we do, I just want to say to the audience, I love providing stuff like this. If you want to support my work, you can go over to plainspoken. You can go to Substack, but there's also my locals, plainspoken.locals.com. And that's where you can be part of a community that is funding my work and is engaging on these topics more broadly, and where sometimes I give special perks and access. So you might consider going over there and signing up to be a subscriber. But even if you don't, I'm happy to provide these resources for free. And there are people like Robert that we really need to learn from. I asked him before we began recording if he wanted to offer a blessing for you and for the Global Methodist Church as we enter into this time of conferencing again. And he said he'd be willing. So let's defer to him as he brings us to the Lord.
Father in heaven, we do pray for the Global Methodist Church, for a new movement of the Spirit of God. Help us to be a part of that movement. Inspire, empower, guide, protect this new movement. And we also pray for the United Methodist Church and pray that their new vision can reach people for Christ and can be a healthy movement and a healthy church. And we pray for each one of those. And we pray for the Church Universal and for your Spirit to be with all of us. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, Robert, again, thank you so much for your many years of service, and thank you now for pouring out some of your wisdom for those who are trying to lead now. And my prayer as we go forward is just that the delegates approach with gravity this wonderful opportunity they've been given to give this new nascent organization a right foothold in the household of God. And so I think your contributions here have greatly helped, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye, friends.